Okay, hey guys, how are you doing today? We're back on Aperture and I'm going to explain the second part of Aperture as I promised. Okay, so yesterday we got the whole gist of the fact that Aperture is all about a nice hole inside your lens that lets light in. Whop, whop, it goes up, goes down, goes up, goes down. Okay, so that's super simple. The other thing we learnt yesterday was that the little numbers, the little aperture numbers, 1, 1.4, 1.8, etc., they let lots of light in. The bigger the number, the less light goes in. Okay, now here's the next step for you. When you get into Aperture, and I'll explain one thing, Aperture doesn't work by itself. What we're going to be doing is talking about Aperture, and then we're going to be talking about shutter speed, we're going to be talking about ISO and metering. But those three things, Aperture, shutter speed and ISO, and I'll explain the shutter speed and the ISO later on, once we put it all together, that's going to be the guts of shooting manual. Okay, so we'll get back to Aperture for a second. When we've got the little hole in the lens that's letting the light in, okay, and we've got the numbers 1, 1.4, 1.8, etc., every time the number goes up or down, it's letting twice as much or half as much light in. So what do I mean? That sounds a bit confusing, doesn't it? Basically, if I've got 1.4 as my aperture, that's really, really wide, I'll be letting heaps of light in. 1.8, half as much. 2, half as much. 2.8, half as much. So every time you see a little notch on the f-stops, they're called, those f-stop numbers, they're either twice as much or half as much, twice as much or half as much. So that's one thing. Here's the next bit. If you've got your aperture and it's wide open, basically the bigger the aperture is, the smaller the focal point is, the smaller the area that's in focus is. Okay, so this is really important. If you're going to get into doing portraits, for example, you might want to have just a little bit of focus. You might want to have just focus on the eyes or focus on the nose, focus on some part of the body. You want other things blurred out, and that's quite a cool sort of look. If you're doing landscapes, for example, you might want to have everything in focus. You might want to have all the grass in the foreground, the sea, the mountains, everything in focus. So for those two things, you're going to be needing a wide open aperture, to have a small focus with the portraits, and you need to have a really small aperture to have a long distance a lot of things in focus later on when you're doing landscape. Okay, so this is just an overview. I'm going to put it all together very soon with the shutter speed and also with the ISO, but just, like I said, the way I like to work is I'm going to give you some information, you just put it in the back of your mind, ponder on it. It'll all come clear as you get more information, but these are all good things that you're going to look back at and think, yeah, that's really handy to know.